So you joined me here after a talk down at the Gov2O Summit on how transparency and accountability can lead to better states. This is a tremendous issue both here in Washington and around the globe. There are enormous amounts of fraud, corruption, inefficiencies in governments. How can technology lead to more accountable, efficient government?
Well, I think, as you say, this isn't an issue just about Washington, nor is it an issue just about the countries that are the poorest and have the reputations for being the most corrupt in the planet. And what I think becomes very evident, and my colleagues and I have certainly discovered, is the building blocks of functioning government and accountable systems are the same anywhere in the world. We've looked at Afghanistan, Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, but we also look at Ireland, Spain, states within the US. And what we've done is to try and take a step back and think about what are the functions of the state, or what's the role of the state in the 21st century? How is it different from the states that people thought about and built 300 years ago? Where is it possible to leapfrog and design very different approaches to building those functions today? And then how do you get the balance right between the state, the market, and civil society? We know now it's not all about the state, nor is it all about the market, and it's about finding those balancing mechanisms, those checks and balances to make it work. So I think the very first thing is to understand what are the conceptual and practical building blocks, both of the role that the state performs and its interaction with the citizenship, how the citizens can get engaged. And then, instead of speaking about corruption or anti-corruption in abstract ways, think about it in very pragmatic and real terms. What does accountability mean? And what does accountability mean in practice? One of the things we've been working on is something we call national accountability systems, where we break down the concept of accountability into its constituent elements. So, and this is fundamentally about accountancy and auditing, but it's about how is a budget put together? How is revenue collected? From whom? How does procurement take place? How do accounts get put together? How do audits get done? And so on. So how do you understand these constituent elements? And I think if we break those down and understand more about them, then two things happen. One is you can bring that kind of transparency around the processes so citizens can get involved. And we can also understand where it is that technology can be applied in terms of new software applications, in terms of online and digital media tools, in terms of biometric data, in terms of tagging, into all sorts of applications where certainly we're going to have to balance privacy and protection of citizens. But we can also bring really quite radical transparency to the process.
So, as you just told me, you recently returned from Afghanistan, and much of that area has not seen a significant, large, stable government for centuries. There are portions which have not been effectively governed because they are effectively tribal. Yeah.
Yes and no.
Okay.
I think the region or the country has been in conflict for 30 years. People talk in the US about a 9-year war, but for the people who live on the ground, it's been a 30-year conflict. Yeah. So certainly a lot of the institutions have degraded. But one of the things that's really astonishing is to look back over the centuries and understand that there are actually local forms of self-governance and governance that do work. And there was a national government, not meaning central, but national meaning across the country, that pretty much did function in the 50s and 60s, even before the Russians came. There are fantastic picture books which show how health services, education services, agriculture banks, industry was being established across the country. And it was pretty much a peaceful country. People talk they could a woman could walk across the territory at night and be unharmed in the 50s and 60s. So contrary to perception, I think one of the myths is that this is ungovernable, it's tribal, it's for the warlords. But that's not the experience of the people on the ground. So there's a lot to build on. And I think one of the other lessons about building institutions and accountable governance is we've got to learn to look very, very carefully at the reality on the ground and understand where the assets are, where the latent capacity exists, where the human capacity exists. And people may not know how to use computers, they may not speak English, but they know how to run their lives, they know how to run their villages. One of the programs I spoke about during Gov 2.0 is an example, one of the examples that does work in Afghanistan, and similar models exist in other countries, which instead of relying on huge, big contracts that go to private contractors and get subcontracted to NGOs, to UN agencies and so on, and by the time some money has been through 5 or 6 contractual layers, with 20% or 30% overheads at each layer, there's very little money left for the citizens. And we see this in developed countries as well, these multiple contracting chains. Instead of that, how do you ensure the resources get straight to the citizens? In Afghanistan, what was created is something called National Solidarity Program. Money put in a trust fund, each village has a bank account. And each village gets a block grant of about $20,000. The village doesn't have to have the money, but if they want it, they have to do 3 things. They elect their village council, they decide together on how to use the money, and then they put accounts up in a public place. And the system pretty much runs itself. And this program's now been active in 28,000 villages across the country. And really what it provides is a platform for governance with radical transparency and accountability, because the accountability mechanisms are social and they're local. And what it provides is a platform for governance. So the villages are building clinic and managing clinics and schools, agricultural investments, irrigation systems, they're building roads. And one of the interesting things that's happening is the villages themselves decide when does it make sense to get together with neighbouring villages. So 37 villages got together to build a maternity hospital because that was the right unit. 187 villages got together to build an irrigation system. But they decide from the bottom up how to organise themselves and how to organise infrastructure.
So if I hear you correctly, it sounds like a great part of accountability and transparency in this particular context is about the bottom up, not about a central government occasionally checking in or having some intricate electronic system for tracking. That there's a much more, I don't want to say grassroots because it's not quite the right word, but a locally driven effort.
I think it's both. So there's an element of top-down and there's an element of bottom-up. And then there's a mesh between the two. And the question is really creating the right design to enable both to work. So, for example, this program wouldn't work unless there was actually quite a centralized trust fund where the money comes in either from the revenue system from the country or from the donors. And that trust fund is checked by auditors and so on, and checked by students and the press. And so you really can follow the money. Because one of the problems if you have so many multiple sources, you can't do that kind of checking. So there is an element of top-down. And in fact, there's a website you can go to that lists all the projects that have been undertaken by the villages. At the same time, there's radical sort of decentralization and bottom-up. So that there's also the accountability at the village level. The villagers know that they're going to get $20,000. And I think sort of pity the person who tries to divert or steal that money from the village because they live there, they're going to see each other day after day.
So like so many things, it's not a binary answer at all. It's really a gradation of the two. When you think about the transparency movement or push here, there is a real move that's to say that anything that's public should be online. Is that something that makes sense in a global context? Does it always make sense to put public information there as a means for accountability?
I think that's an extremely interesting question. In fact, my colleagues and I from our organisation were over in Nepal recently, and we were making the case that everything should be online. All the accounts of the system, the nation should be online. And actually it was a young woman student who stood up and said, but if that happened, there would be a crisis. If the public really knew what was going on, wouldn't that provoke social unrest or something? So I think on balance, I'm going to say, no, put it online. It'll bring the accountability and the systems will change. So I think it's about putting budgets online within countries. We focus a lot on aid money, and that's fine, but the real money in the system is the revenue from the country itself. So how do we put budgets online? We know now that this is technically possible. There are universities in California that have their entire accounts, sort of $10 billion accounts, online, and you can search by pencil or by staff salary or by any category. So the models and the technology exists. How can we transpose this and apply it to country settings? I think it needs to be done, and may cause some shocks to the system in the short term, but over time will change the incentives and allow citizens to become real agents of accountability as well as the principles of the system. But I do think also it can be applied to UN agencies, NGOs and others who take public taxpayers and private citizens' money to spend in these contexts as well.
Right. It would seem that having that transparency does in fact enforce some level of accountability if everyone can see it. Well, thanks again for taking the time to come talk some more. I'm looking forward to seeing both the video of your interview this morning go up and this as well.